This is an LA Times Studios podcast.
My name is Sammy Roth, and I'm the climate columnist for the Los Angeles Times. This is Boiling Point. It's possible you've heard of the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It came out in 1962, and it exposed the devastating health consequences of the toxic pesticide DDT. The book's publication was one of several key events that brought on the modern environmental movement, a movement that gave us the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, and, here in the Golden State, the California Environmental Quality Act. Half a century later, that law, the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, has made a lot of enemies. And now another book has mobilized the state legislature to say, hey, maybe all these environmental protections in CEQA haven't always been so good for the environment. The book is called Abundance. It was published in March, written by the journalists Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Basically, it's an argument that for Democrats to compete against President Trump and Republicans at a national level, they need to make it easier to build stuff that makes life better. As Klein wrote in the New York Times, and I'm going to quote a bit at length here, "It has become too hard to build and too expensive to live in the places where Democrats govern. It is too hard to build homes. It is too hard to build clean energy. It is too hard to build mass transit. The problem isn't technical. We know how to build apartment complexes and solar panel arrays and train lines. The problem is the rules and the laws and political cultures that govern construction in many blue states." Close quote. That's especially important, according to Klein, because of the Republican Party's anti-immigrant policies. Those policies, and I'm going to quote here again, are powered by scarcity. When there is not enough to go around, we look with suspicion on anyone who might take what we have. That suspicion is the fuel of Trump's politics. Close quote. Which brings us to abundance. Make it easier to build apartments and solar and wind farms and public transit. Give everybody enough. It's an idea that's enchanting to a lot of Democrats in Sacramento, including Governor Gavin Newsom. Last month, Newsom signed 2 bills that, in theory, will make it easier to build housing. They'll do that by rolling back portions of, drumroll please, the California Environmental Quality Act. Specifically, they'll roll back portions of the law requiring detailed environmental review of certain housing projects. At the signing ceremony for the bill, Newsom credited none other than the journalist Ezra Klein.
Thank you for your abundant mindset. It's a plug to Ezra. And it really is about abundance.
The question is abundance the right idea? Can fewer environmental regulations really lead to more housing and more renewable energy and more public transit? And even if the answer is yes, are there negative side effects that would make the whole thing just a bad trade-off? This episode of Boiling Point is part 1 of a 2-part series on abundance. Our guest is Liam Dillon, a colleague of mine at the LA Times. He covers housing, and he wrote about those controversial bills that Newsom signed last month. Next week's episode of the podcast will be all about abundance and renewable energy. But first, let's talk housing. And of course, climate. Because housing, like everything else, is a climate story.
During one of the most severe windstorms Southern California experienced in more than a decade, the Palisades and Eaton fires ignited, leaving heartbreaking losses in our communities. Now, as we build back, we're building stronger, cleaner, and more resilient. In communities most vulnerable to dangerous weather conditions and wildfires, Southern California Edison is placing power lines underground, hardening the electric system by installing wires with protective coating, and adding advanced technology to help keep communities safe. So when Southern California faces the next storm, the next most severe event,
Copy helicopters, structures adjacent here at Piper Road.
we'll be ready. Learn more at sce.com/disaster recovery.
Today is the worst day of Abby's life. The 17-year-old cradles her newborn son in her arms.
They all saw how much I loved him. They didn't have to take him from me.
Between 1945 and the early 1970s, families shipped their pregnant teenage daughters to maternity homes and forced them to secretly place their babies for adoption. In hidden corners across America, it's still happening.
My parents had me locked up in the godparent home against my will. They worked with them to manipulate me and to steal my son away from me.
The godparent home is the brainchild of controversial preacher Jerry Falwell, the father of the modern evangelical right and the founder of Liberty University, where powerful men, emboldened by their faith, determine who gets to be a parent and who must give their child away. Follow Liberty Lost on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Liam, thanks very much for being with us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff today, housing in California, abundance, what that means for climate change, but sort of running beneath it all, the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which I'm guessing you've learned way more about in your career than you probably ever dreamed.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Talk a little bit about, I'm guessing plenty of listeners to this are familiar with CEQA. Some are probably less so. What is CEQA? Give us a little bit of background. Where did it come from? What does it do in practice? And why on earth is it so deeply related to the housing situation in California?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. CEQA passed, signed into law by Ronald Reagan, which many people note for good or for ill, in 1970 when he was governor of California. And it is, I guess, deceptively simple given the sort of the mythos around this law and what it actually says. All it really says is that any proponent of any particular development project must disclose and, if possible, lessen the environmental effects of a project before being approved. And that's it. Now, granted, we're going to talk about all the things that actually means in practice, but the reality of what the law says is pretty straightforward.
Okay. So when you try to build housing in California, what does that mean for you? You're a developer, you want to build. I think it doesn't apply to single-family housing is what I understand. But if you want to build an apartment building or a duplex or a fourplex, what do you actually have to do in terms of CEQA?
So it applies in some context for single-family housing, like a big greenfield development somewhere. You're going to have to do, some sort of CEQA analysis. There are other sort of limited effects, but like say a rebuild of a home in the Pacific Palisades or Altadena, there are a wide variety of exemptions where that CEQA would not really be impacted. What it essentially says is, for say an apartment project, you would have to do all these environmental analyses to different levels of them to potentially examine all of these potential effects of it. And again, sounds simple, but maybe that would involve soil testing. Maybe that would involve testing how much noise that the project is going to create during construction. Obviously, there's traffic studies that are involved. There are all these sorts of studies that you have to do at sort of the highest level for these projects to allow them ultimately to be approved. And then what can happen is that there are lawsuits that say, hey, you didn't study the soil appropriately or you didn't study the traffic appropriately. And then if a judge agrees, that could sort of throw the approval process out entirely. And all of a sudden, you're kind of set back a couple years. And so really what development lawyers and developers tell me the biggest concern, or one of the biggest concerns about CEQA and how it operates with respect to housing, is the risk that is involved. Right? It's not necessarily the studies themselves, although they can be, 1,000 pages and time-consuming and potentially burdensome, but really the risk that you did all this work for a couple years to try to get your, 6-story apartment complex approved, and then all of a sudden it's thrown out and you're back at square one.
So that risk that you're describing, I think that was at the crux of a lot of this debate that just took place in the legislature. And I want to talk about, get the details of these two bills that were just passed with all of these CEQA exemptions. But, that's one of the arguments that I hear all of the time from environmental groups and from folks who don't want to see CEQA changed is they point at statistics and say, and I'm not trying to discredit it, but they point at statistics and they say, hey, only, something like 3%, I think is a number I've seen used a lot, and maybe even in your stories, only 3% housing developments actually have lawsuits filed against them, and correct me if I'm wrong on that. But, as an argument that, CEQA isn't really the main barrier to housing. And,
right.
What you've reported is that developers are saying, no, it's not so much the lawsuits themselves, it's the risk that we're going to get sued that's really the obstacle here. Could you talk about, what you found in your reporting there, and how big an issue is CEQA and, this housing shortage and how housing prices in California?
It's a really good question. The stats that you quoted, yes, there are studies. I've reported the studies that you mentioned. About 3% of developments or housing developments are challenged under CEQA. There are some other studies that show perhaps a little bit being more robust. What developers have told me too, though, is it's really impossible to quantify the threat of litigation. But all this really centers around what I think is the central element to CEQA and how it plays into development in California, and why this change, which I know we're going to talk about in terms of what it does, really is, in my view, and a lot of the experts I've spoken with, pretty profound. And that is, CEQA has really embedded itself as this point of leverage in any and all development in California. And what it means is that there's sort of an extra political, if you will, process that goes into beyond just getting a project voted up or voted down at a city council. Now, this can be used for sort of good or bad, right, depending on your perspective. Say there is a warehouse project that you don't like in a community that has a significant amount of warehouses already. They're not great projects for the environment, right? If the city council happens to be friendly to the warehouse industry, then maybe you don't have a voice there, and CEQA gives you a voice to engage on the specific warehouse project where you wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
Well, that's why there are a lot of environmental justice groups that are very fierce defenders of CEQA, because that's one of their best tools for preventing, more air pollution from increasing spread of warehouses in the Inland Empire, for instance.
Absolutely, yeah. But then you could also see that being used in sort of ways that I think aren't, they're sort of nominally about the environment, but not really, if we're really being honest, and there's a ton of classic examples. One of my favorite is about 15 years ago in San Jose. There was a gas station that wanted to add a few pumps, and it turned out that they were sued by a rival gas station across the street under CEQA. And this sort of embedded leverage has really been around forever. I have a couple other really good examples, if you allow me.
The Rick Caruso one was interesting to me that you've cited.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I did an interview with Mayor Karen Bass right after she took office in 2022, asked her about CEQA, whether it should be changed. And she said, well, yes, but, and this is what a lot of people have said over the years. She talked about that as a community organizer in South LA in the 90s, she was taught by West Side lawyers who represented homeowner groups that you can use CEQA and to stop the proliferation of liquor stores being built in South LA. And so this was not about the environment, right? I mean, even though nominally that's what these were about, this is really about the leverage that she could use as a community organizer to stop something that she thought was harmful to her community. And so that's sort of one bucket. And again, going back to the 90s, right? Rick Caruso, her opponent in the most recent mayoral election, big-time developer, right? Owns these shopping malls, owns developments.
Criticizes CEQA constantly.
Constantly, and yet, this year, when the redevelopment of Television City near his Grove Mall was approved by the city council, his company sued under CEQA because he wants different traffic patterns or all these sorts of things, right? But the CEQA was the leverage tool that was used. That is available to big billionaire developers like Rick Caruso and environmental justice groups in the Inland Empire to tackle projects sort of outside of the straight regular city council or otherwise approval process.
So this seems like a good moment to stop beating around the bush and get at what the legislature did a couple of weeks ago. Talk about these two bills and what's in them, one in the Assembly, one in the Senate, and that Governor Newsom pretty much forced the legislature to pass, and we don't have to get into the logistics of how he did that, but what has changed now? What is different than it was, a month and a half ago?
So I think it's easy to talk about the urban housing. It's sort of cleaner. And so what that did was a straightaway exemption for all low-rise and mid-rise urban housing projects, so not your sort of greenfield development, but like developments in urbanized areas already. It's the technical term is infill, right? And so for those projects, there is a clean exemption, which means no other sort of rules you have to follow.
No environmental review. Yeah. You don't have to go through the environmental impact report process or anything like that.
Correct. So a clean exemption from the CEQA rules that we had just talked about earlier for that kind of housing. And importantly, this is another sort of important note about how CEQA politics has worked over the years, is that there is no tying of that to anything else, right? So that means that there is no requirement that you have to dedicate a certain number of units as low-income housing, and also that there are no requirements to pay construction workers or otherwise use union labor, whereas previous reforms that have attempted to streamline the housing development process or touch CEQA have included additives like that. So, for instance, if you were to use this exemption or use this sort of streamlining mechanism, you'd have to add things like inclusionary housing, dedicating a certain part of the development to low income, or some sort of union requirement. And that no longer exists. So it's a totally clean exemption for housing that's sort of mid-rise and low-rise for 100% affordable housing. And for high-rise housing, there are some labor pay requirements tied to that.
Yeah, the labor pay requirements, just to deal with that briefly. So that was you talk about the leverage point. So organized labor has traditionally used CEQA as one of these leverage tools, right? That
correct.
They won't gum up the works as long as they, get a requirement that housing gets built with union labor.
And so now that union level wages.
Union level wages. Okay, so now for these types of infill projects, mid-rise and high-rise buildings, for the most part,
mid-rise and low-rise.
Excuse me, mid-rise and low-rise. Thank you. It's a lot of words to keep track of. Mid-rise and low-rise. That's not the case anymore. Union labor no longer has that leverage point through CEQA.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So this makes it easier to build low-rise and mid-rise buildings in cities in developed areas.
Yes.
Okay. So that's one of the bills. What's the other one?
So the other one was sort of this mishmash of things. This was the Senate version of this sort of their CEQA reform, and it goes back. It does a lot of different things. One of the things that rather than a blanket exemption like you have now for urban housing, what it did was sort of pick this kind of grab bag of things that over the years CEQA has been used as kind of highish profile cases to sort of challenge. So, for instance, there was a Planned Parenthood clinic that was challenged years ago in South San Francisco by pro-life protesters, a pro-life group, and under CEQA, right? And now there's an exemption in the law for health clinics. They are not, subject to CEQA. There was a food pantry, a food bank that also in Northern California a few years ago that was challenged under CEQA. And so this law now exempts food banks from the CEQA process. And there's a few other of these. I think the most controversial is what's known as advanced manufacturing facilities.
Right, that's basically like semiconductor plants, right?
Yeah, things like that. And I think the motivating factor by the authors of this exemption was to try to allow for things that was projects that were anticipated or were supported by the Biden administration's sort of infrastructure bills. Want to make sure that the idea is that California would be able to accept some of that money and build projects, and so like that was where that idea came from, right? But I do know there's been significant pushback among the environmental community, in particular, for that exemption that was written into this sort of grab bag of CEQA exemptions that got passed.
Right, because there's a question of whether these big industrial facilities, like why not study the environmental consequences of them? I think that's the question that's been raised.
Yeah, this bill, in many ways, this kind of grab bag continues what some CEQA observers have called over the years Swiss cheese CEQA. So that means that you're not actually reforming CEQA wholesale. What you're doing is poking these holes to say, well, this specific project, this specific case, this specific thing that we actually want, we don't want CEQA to hold that up anymore. And so this sort of continues that kind of, Swiss cheese CEQA, just with more holes, if you will.
On infill housing in particular, the bill that makes it easier to build housing in cities and developed areas, low-rise and mid-rise, the argument against this bill from environmental groups, from a lot of environmental groups, not all, is you're just continuing to erode CEQA. You're continuing to erode, this foundational environmental law that gives the public the right to understand the impacts of and challenge negative environmental impacts, even if, there are cases where this bill has clearly been used for non-environmental purposes. I want to just bring up here on my screen the story that one of our colleagues, Haley Smith, wrote about the reaction to this bill from environmental groups. And there's a quote in here from a coalition of more than 100 environmental or 100 organizations, many of them environmental groups, who wrote, quote, "This bill is the worst anti-environmental bill in California in recent memory. It represents an unprecedented rollback to California's fundamental environmental and community protections at a time in which the people of California grapple with the unprecedented federal attacks to their lives and livelihoods." Basically saying that, one, this is bad to begin with. Two, especially when the Trump administration is, gutting federal climate science and efforts to study the environmental reviews of projects. Why is California doing the same thing? I guess my question for you is, are there projects that might legitimately, really need environmental study now that are not going to get them? I mean, you talked about all of the facetious ways that CEQA is used. What about the advanced manufacturing stuff? Are there ways here in which we're now not going to know things environmentally that we should know potentially?
I think, to be perfectly frank, the answer is yes, right? And I think if even the supporters of this, if you got them in a room and held it over them, I think they would also say yes. But I think the argument, though, to walk that back a little bit, is what's the correct balance? Right? If in fact we stop, under the current regime, totally hypothetical, right? It's under the current regime or pre-reform regime, we're able to stop one bad project, quote unquote bad project, but also stop 5 good projects because of the way that the law had worked. Is that a better outcome than, say, those 5 good projects and 1 bad project? Right? Like getting through under a reform outcome. And I don't think that there's an exact clear answer to that, but I think the supporters of this would say, look, we don't have enough housing in California. That's a huge problem for affordability. And homelessness, which are 2 of the chief issues that people care about and people talk about and are affecting people's quality of life, causing people to move, to Texas and to Arizona and to other areas of the country where, which are actually worse for people to live there than in California from a climate perspective.
Right, because they're going to drive more miles and use less.
They're going to drive more miles, use more air conditioning in Arizona, right? Than coastal California, and so that's sort of this balancing act.
Is there a potential here for a positive climate impact? Because, people who work in climate talk all the time about how we need to have more, dense infill housing in cities to make it easier for people to drive fewer miles. Rather than building sprawling subdivisions out into the hinterlands where people have, one, which destroys wildlife habitat, but 2, and even more important from a climate perspective, so that people aren't driving long distances into city centers to work.
Plus the wildfire impacts, especially acute now, right, of that kind of development.
Oh, yeah, for sure, building in the wildland-urban interface. Is this, realistically, is there a chance that this bill helps with that if you make it easier to build in developed areas? Okay.
Absolutely, and this has been sort of targeted and talked about. For over a decade now, 15 getting on 20 years, the state has attempted, as part of its climate policy, attempted to incentivize development in urban cores more than development on the fringes. That's been a key plank of climate policy. And in fact, as you do the modeling, the Air Resources Board does the California Air Resources Board, which is in charge of the state's climate goals. And they do their modeling. You could put all the electric cars you want on the road, do all these sorts of solar and whatever, like all the things, right? But you're still not going to meet the climate goals that the state has going forward without a significant reduction in driving. And the only way that happens, or one way that happens, or you can incentivize that to happen, is you have people live closer to where they work, closer to where they shop, and have stuff around them.
We'll be back after a quick break.
During one of the most severe windstorms Southern California experienced in more than a decade, the Palisades and Eaton fires ignited, leaving heartbreaking losses in our communities. Now, as we build back, we're building stronger, cleaner, and more resilient. In communities most vulnerable to dangerous weather conditions and wildfires, Southern California Edison is placing power lines underground, hardening the electric system by installing wires with protective coating, and adding advanced technology to help keep communities safe. So when Southern California faces the next storm, the next most severe event,
Copy helicopters, structures adjacent here to Piper Road.
We'll be ready. Learn more at sce.com/disaster recovery.
Today is the worst day of Abby's life. The 17-year-old cradles her newborn son in her arms.
They all saw how much I loved him. They didn't have to take him from me.
Between 1945 and the early 1970s, families shipped their pregnant teenage daughters to maternity homes and forced them to secretly place their babies for adoption. In hidden corners across America, it's still happening.
My parents had me locked up in the godparent home against my will. They worked with them to manipulate me and to steal my son away from me.
The godparent home is the brainchild of controversial preacher Jerry Falwell, the father of the modern evangelical right and the founder of Liberty University, where powerful men, emboldened by their faith, determine who gets to be a parent and who must give their child away. Follow Liberty Lost on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
What is this bill going to mean for the affordability of the housing that does, in theory, more of it get built because of this? Because you made 2 points earlier that I didn't understand how they related to each other. One about, waiving requirements for 100% affordable housing, but then you also said something else about a requirement for, a percentage being affordable getting waived. And I just wasn't sure how those two things comported with each other. So could you explain the implications here?
Absolutely. So it's two separate things. The simpler is that for projects that are 100% affordable, they will under this new law will get a CEQA exemption, but developers of those 100% affordable projects will have to pay construction workers union level wages in order for that exemption to be to take effect. And the argument is many of the funding requirements for 100% affordable housing projects require that level of union wages anyway. So that's one. The other issue you raised is in a lot of previous bills that attempted, because there have been hundreds, right, that have passed in the last decade or so at the state level that have attempted to spur construction of housing across the state. A lot of those bills, if a developer wanted to take advantage of that sort of streamlined process or easier process to get approved, they would have to dedicate a certain percentage of their development to low-income housing. And in this case, that's not the case. So for this, the low-rise and mid-rise CEQA exemption, the low-rise and mid-rise housing CEQA exemption, there is no requirement to dedicate a certain percentage of any development for affordable housing. And the argument for why that is a better, both from a development and affordability perspective, is that that requirement to set aside a percentage for affordable housing raises costs, and that when it raises costs to the
cost
point
of
where
building, that is
the cost of building, and so it ends up being that the project doesn't get built, and so the argument is that the consensus among studies is that more housing growth, even just straight market rate housing growth, helps ameliorate rent increases, price increases in a region sort of writ large. No matter what kind of housing gets built. So more,
right, basically you're increasing supply and therefore you're putting pressure downward on prices. Okay. I imagine that's still contentious to make that argument.
It is indeed. At the studies at a regional level, though, is a fairly high consensus that is true. When you get to more of a granular level, like a block level or a neighborhood level, then there's a lot more a dispute over, say, you put a new development in a gentrifying neighborhood that's market rate. What does that mean, for displacement? And that is a bit more contentious of an argument from a research perspective. Yes.
So you spoke a moment ago about union level wages on 100% affordable housing projects, and I want to talk a little bit more about the role of labor and the split in labor underneath this whole fight. But let's do a whole breakout session on that. We've been doing a new feature every week. We're calling it the Rabbit Hole. At least I'm informally calling it the Rabbit Hole. So for subscribers to the LA Times, look in your podcast feed for a separate segment where Liam and I talk separately about the interesting labor splits in this CEQA debate and in climate policy debate and housing in general. And so look for that separately. Thank you for everyone who's subscribing. But for now, I promised that this was going to be nominally an episode on abundance. So let's talk about abundance a little bit. It's this idea that has clearly animated the governor, Gavin Newsom, in terms of the thinking, that underlying this whole set of legislation and why he pushed this through in the way he did. Liam, explain this abundance concept and where it came from, first of all. What does that word even mean? Why are we talking about it?
Yeah, so I think, this has been really popularized in Democratic circles. It's based on a book that was written by New York Times opinion journalist Ezra Klein and another journalist, Derek Thompson. I believe he recently left the Atlantic magazine, that essentially, and this came out either the beginning of this year or the end of last, essentially argues that Democrats in blue states have gotten in their own way when it comes to producing the things that we say we need, or we, meaning, I guess in this case, the Democratic establishment says that we need for a better future, right? More affordable housing, more clean energy, all these sorts of things that to
public
realize
transit as well, I think.
Public transit, yeah. To realize these dreams, you actually have to build them. Right? You have to build more houses. You have to build the solar fields. You have to build the wind turbines. You have to build the high-speed rail, right? You can't just sort of talk about why these are good things, right? And the argument that Klein and Thompson make in their book Abundance is that a lot of these rules, and they actually do call out CEQA fairly prominently in the book, environmental rules that have passed, say, 50, 60, 70 years ago, have strangled these sorts of these investments and this infrastructure that states need to have a transition to a green economy, ensure that people can live in their communities affordably, and they can get around.
Why do you think the abundance concept resonated with Gavin Newsom, and more broadly has resonated with a segment of the, I don't want to try to sound like I'm using this term disparagingly, but like the neoliberal left, the way that it has?
Yeah. So some grounding. As I've been saying, these kind of like housing reform stuff or housing changes or streamlining, that's been going on like at the state level in California for like close to a decade, right? There have been hundreds of bills that have been passed in this vein. And it kind of corresponds with the rise of the YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, which began in San Francisco and is sort of now extended all over the country. And it argues that zoning regulations, things like CEQA, have been barriers to development that is needed to help ameliorate affordability problems in Los Angeles, San Francisco, California, the rest of the country. And so this is, abundance is, I think, an extension of that. But the long way of saying the groundwork in California has long been laid for this kind of discussion. It's just a little bit of a reframe. And I think that, this reframe, particularly in this sort of national concept, I think also is attractive to the governor, frankly, because he, by a lot of accounts, wants to run for president. And likes the idea and have the support of folks who are arguing that blue state leaders need to do more to tear down some of these barriers to the growth that is needed to ensure that the future that many liberals promise can be delivered on.
Yeah, I mean, it annoys me frequently when journalists try to act as prognosticators instead of sort of just describing what's going on and analyzing them. But I mean, do you think there's potential for this to work? I mean, I guess what do you think needs to happen for this to work as a strategy for Newsom? Like, between now and 2028, it's not probably there's going to be, I don't know, could there be a lot of housing growth between now and then to the point where it really propels a presidential run? I guess I'm just trying to game out what could happen.
Yeah, as we've been saying, there's a lot. I don't know what tariffs are going to look like. There's that, interest rates. all these things, right, are really predictive of what and when housing gets built, right? But I think sort of the argument, the counter argument to that is, well, can California's home production rate get closer to something more like what it is in Texas? Right, because the interest rates are the same in Texas. The material prices are the same in Texas, right? And so, can you have growth in California? Because people want to live here. People want to live in LA. They want to live in San Francisco. They want to live in San Diego. They want to live all over this state, and they would come if you let there be more housing, right? And so, it's not like the demand isn't there. I think sort of the idea is, he could potentially argue, well, look, we're now, growing on a margin faster than we were, and that's because I've gotten rid of some of these things that have been in our way.
Yeah. What it reminds me of at a national level, since I'm focus on energy as a climate journalist, is these debates over permitting reform, which are energy focused. Is there's this left and right sort of center leaning bipartisan consensus of we need to make it easier to build energy infrastructure, and you've got folks on the right who care mostly about building fossil fuel infrastructure, and you've got folks on the left who mostly want to make it easier to build solar and wind and transmission lines. And the folks on the left are, essentially willing to say, well, if we make it easier to build all energy infrastructure, the good stuff will win out. Solar and wind is cheaper. We'll just mostly end up building good stuff. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I'm also sympathetic to environmental activists who are frustrated and say, look, why do anything that's going to make it easier to build an oil pipeline or a liquefied natural gas terminal? Some of that bad stuff is going to get built too and hurt people. And I think of the formulation you used a few minutes ago of, maybe it's a worthwhile trade-off to build 5 good things, even if one bad thing gets through. But sometimes I also just wonder, instead of doing these procedural reforms, reforming CEQA or reforming NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which comes up in permitting reform conversations, is there not some way to just, try to pass laws? At the national level, this is impossible because of Congress. But, even in California, couldn't we just say, here, let's just make it easy to do good things and hard to do bad things? I know that's probably sounds really dumb to someone who works in state policy, but
no,
I don't know. It always seems to come down to how do we get the process right, and not well, what do we want to do? Let's do this and not do that. I don't know. I just don't quite get it.
Well, just reflect on that a little bit. In some sense, that's what these bills try to do, right? This is exempting the urban infill housing, right, which is the quote-unquote good thing, while also saying kind of the greenfield sprawl, suburban single-family sprawl development is not subject to these same waivers, right? So that's
fair.
Sort of
that's
one.
Fair. No, that's fair.
And then second, that's basically what the sort of the Swiss cheese CEQA reality has been, which is that we find a thing that everyone's like, oh my God, we have to do this. I think, most famous recently, there was enrollment at UC Berkeley, right? Increased enrollment was threatened under a CEQA lawsuit, right? And so the state said, oh my God, that's ridiculous. We have to let more people come to one of the flagship universities in the state. So we're just going to write one quick bill, which they passed in 3 days, and have the governor sign it, that said, enrollment at UC Berkeley not subject to CEQA, right? And so that's what has been happening. And unfortunately, that kind of piecemeal kind of approach gets you to the point where every year or two there's some new outrage, and then they respond to the one outrage by passing the one law, but the underlying mechanisms are not changed. Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Maybe that's exactly what I'm talking about, and I'm just confused why semiconductor plants were in there.
But I think that's. I think even the supporters of this have expressed some openness to perhaps revisiting that the advanced manufacturing facilities exemption. But also, I want to be clear that there are times when you can't just have a game where there's all winners, right? There are. Is it better? I know you've reported and written about this a lot, right? But probably having a solar farm or transmission line next to you, probably not the best thing it's probably not pleasant, right? In some ways that literally have that next to your property or next to your farm or next to your whatever. But the reality is they have to go somewhere. And what are we going to do?
You make a fabulous point, and it's especially good because it cites my reporting, so how can I argue with that? William, I appreciate your talking us through all of the details of this because I know it's monstrously complicated, and you've got all the details down. What do you think is going to happen next? Is the legislature going to go and revisit any of this, or are we done with CEQA reform for a while?
So I think there may be some changes around the margins as it relates to perhaps some of the advanced manufacturing facilities or some of the things that have gotten the most sort of heat. But I think, I was talking to one of the drivers of this, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, who represents a Democrat from Oakland. And this is before this passed. And I was like, hey, talking to people, no one seems to tell me this is going to unleash the flood of construction that you say you need. Right. So leverage point, great. But and yes, big deal, white whale, third rail, all those sorts of things, great. But what is, what are you going to do? And she's like, well, we need to figure out how to get more housing built. This is a key plank, a key thing. And so she is going to keep driving on that point. I know that there are others. And so I'm not sure how much more legislation, high profile legislation may be attempted or may get through. But I think, yes, for now, this is a major, probably the biggest change that has happened to CEQA and since it passed in 1970. But I don't think you've seen the end of efforts to try to spur housing production in the state, for sure.
Well, we will just have to keep writing about it and talking about it. And Liam, thanks very much for being on Boiling Point. Really important conversation.
Thanks again for having me.
Like I said earlier, that was part one of a two-part series on abundance. Check back next week for our episode on renewable energy. We're going to have a conservation activist and a representative from the solar industry debating abundance. And for LA Times podcast subscribers, don't forget, we've also got a rabbit hole this week talking with Liam about the role of labor in the CEQA debate. Thank you, as always, for listening. Thank you for listening to Boiling Point. I'm your host, Sammy Roth. My producers are Mary Knopf and Jonathan Shiflett. Sound design and original music by Jonathan Shiflett. Elijah Wolfson is our editor. Denise Callahan is our studio manager. Ben Church is our production manager. Nick Norton is our engineer. Special thanks to LA Times studio president Anna Magzanian, president and chief operating officer of the Los Angeles Times, Chris Argentieri, and executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, Terry Tang. Boiling Point is executive produced by Darius Derrickson and created by me, Sammy Roth.
Today is the worst day of Abby's life. The 17-year-old cradles her newborn son in her arms.
They all saw how much I loved him. They didn't have to take him from me.
Between 1945 and the early 1970s, families shipped their pregnant teenage daughters to maternity homes and forced them to secretly place their babies for adoption. In hidden corners across America, it's still happening.
My parents had me locked up in the godparent home against my will. They worked with them to manipulate me and to steal my son away from me.
The godparent home is the brainchild of controversial preacher Jerry Falwell, the father of the modern evangelical right and the founder of Liberty University, where powerful men, emboldened by their faith, determine who gets to be a parent and who must give their child away. Follow Liberty Lost on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jane Coaston, former writer and podcaster for places like the New York Times, The Atlantic, and National Review. And now I'm here to hang out with you, 5 days a week on What a Day, Crooked's daily news podcast. That's right, now who's respected on both sides. These days, it's hard to separate what matters from all the noise, especially when the noise is an elderly guy mumbling conspiracy theories he heard on Newsmax. That's why every weekday, the team and I scour the headlines to bring you the stories that matter most to the way you live, in just 20 minutes. You can listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts.